Did the US Navy accidentally sink a Japanese submarine with a potato? It sounds like a joke, like something out of a cartoon. But this story, or at least parts of it, has been floating around for a long time. It's one of those tales people tell, usually with a chuckle. A US Navy ship, a Japanese submarine, and an ordinary potato. It's an unlikely mix for a serious wartime event, but sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes fiction is just a good story that gets told too many times. Let's be clear from the start. No, the US Navy did not sink a Japanese submarine with a potato. Not really. Not in the way you might imagine a potato being a weapon. A potato is soft. It's food, it doesn't explode, it doesn't pierce steel hulls, it can't sink a vessel designed to withstand immense pressure. So, the direct answer is a firm no. But like many enduring myths, there's usually a tiny kernel of truth, or at least an interesting incident, that sparks the whole thing. And this story has a very specific, very human origin during the chaos of World War II. The idea itself is funny. Picture a sailor, under fire, holding up a potato and throwing it. And then, somehow, a massive, deadly war machine just gives up and sinks. It doesn't fit with what we know about naval combat. Modern warships are built tough. Submarines are especially resilient, built to survive the crushing depths of the ocean. They are hunted by powerful explosives, advanced sonar, and well-trained crews. A potato just doesn't factor into that equation. But the story persists. Why? Because it's memorable, it's absurd, it sticks in your mind in a way that dry historical facts sometimes don't. It offers a moment of levity in the grim reality of war. It's a human touch in a world of machines and destruction. So even though it's not true in the literal sense, understanding why people tell this story and what incident gave birth to it tells us something interesting about how history gets remembered, and sometimes misremembered. The real story involves a specific US Navy destroyer, the USS O'Bannon, and a Japanese submarine, I-38. It happened in April 1943, during the thick of the war in the Pacific. This wasn't some quiet patrol. This was a brutal fight for survival, where every ship and every sailor faced constant danger. The submarines were a huge threat, silently stalking convoys and warships. Destroyers were their hunters. The fight between a destroyer and a submarine was always a tense, deadly game of cat and mouse. The USS O'Bannon was a Fletcher-class destroyer, a highly successful and famous type of ship. She was known for her aggressive actions and a string of battle honors. Her crew was experienced and battle-hardened. They had seen plenty of combat. They knew what it meant to fight for their lives and their ship. So, when they encountered the Japanese submarine, it was just another day at the office, but a very dangerous office. What happened on that day was unique enough to become legend, but it wasn't about sinking a submarine with food. It was about a very close-quarters encounter, a bit of quick thinking, and a legendary prank that grew far beyond its original intent. The actual events were serious, involving skilled sailors, powerful weapons, and a fight for survival. The potato was just a quirky footnote, an odd detail that got exaggerated over time. So, while we can put the potato sink submarine idea to rest as a literal event, we can't ignore the story completely. It's a good example of how war stories evolve, how anecdotes become legends, and how sometimes a strange little detail can capture the imagination more than the stark truth. We'll look closer at the actual encounter involving the USS O'Bannon. We'll explore the real dangers of anti-submarine warfare in World War II. And we'll see how a humble potato found its way into one of the most unlikely naval legends of all time. The myth of the potato-sinking submarine didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's tied directly to the realities of World War II. During those years, naval warfare was intense. The Pacific Theater, where this story originated, saw massive, brutal battles between the United States and Japan. Both sides relied heavily on their navies. Submarines played a crucial role. They were stealthy hunters able to sink enemy supply ships, troop transports, and even warships. But they were also hunted relentlessly. Anti-submarine warfare was a deadly game. For the U.S. Navy, destroyers were the primary submarine hunters. These fast, agile ships were equipped with sonar, a technology that used sound waves to detect objects underwater. Once a submarine was detected, the destroyer would move in for the kill. The main weapon against submarines was the depth charge. These depth charges were basically barrels of high explosives designed to be dropped into the water and detonate at a preset depth. The idea wasn't necessarily to hit the submarine directly. The immense pressure wave from an underwater explosion could crush a submarine's hull, break its internal systems, or simply scare the crew into surfacing. Multiple depth charges dropped in patterns could create a basket of explosions that gave a submerged submarine little chance of escape. This was serious business. Submarine crews knew the sound of approaching destroyers and the terrifying pings of sonar. The destroyer crews knew that a single torpedo from a submarine could end their ship and their lives. There was no room for error, no room for jokes when an actual engagement was underway. The stakes were life and death. So, when we talk about a potato, it clashes sharply with this grim reality. Imagine a depth charge exploding. It's a massive shockwave, a violent tremor that rattles everything. Now imagine a potato. It drops, it splashes. That's it. The contrast makes the myth even more compelling because it's so absurdly out of place. The specific incident that started this story involved the USS O'Bannon and the Japanese submarine I-38. The O'Bannon was a tough ship. She earned a Presidential Unit Citation and 17 battle stars during the war. Her crew was known for being resourceful and aggressive. In April 1943, near the Solomon Islands, the O'Bannon was escorting a convoy. This was prime hunting ground for Japanese submarines. One morning, the O'Bannon made radar contact. It was a Japanese submarine, surfaced. This was unusual. Submarines usually only surface to recharge batteries or travel faster in calm waters. But this one was there. The O'Bannon immediately turned to intercept. What happened next was a chaotic close-quarters battle. The O'Bannon, moving at full speed, bore down on the submarine. The Japanese sub, realizing it was caught, started to dive, but it was too late. The O'Bannon rammed it, not intentionally, but because the sub was trying to dive right under its bow. The impact scraped along the submarine's hull. This wasn't a gentle bump, it was a violent collision. The two vessels were now almost side by side, very close. Too close for the O'Bannon to use its main guns. The big guns couldn't depress enough to hit the submarine right next to them, and it was too close for depth charges, which would have damaged the destroyer itself. This is where the story gets really interesting. The crews of both ships were now almost face to face. The sailors on the O'Bannon could look down onto the deck of the Japanese submarine. The Japanese sailors, scrambling to get below or man their deck gun, could look up at the destroyer. Well, accounts say that at this point, some O'Bannon crewmen started throwing things down at the Japanese submarine. What they threw varies in the retellings, but the most popular version, and the one that fueled the potato myth, is that they threw potatoes. Why potatoes? Well, destroyers carried provisions, and potatoes were common. They were probably just sitting in a sack nearby. It was a spur-of-the-moment desperate act, a mixture of frustration, panic, and dark humor. The idea wasn't to sink the submarine. It was likely meant to distract the Japanese crew, to keep them from manning their deck gun, to disorient them, to make them think the Americans were crazy. Or maybe it was just a raw, immediate reaction to the absurdity of being so close to the enemy. The actual impact of the potatoes was, of course, zero in terms of damage. They simply bounced off the submarine's metal hull. The Japanese crew probably wondered what was happening, or just ignored them in their scramble to dive. The submarine completed its dive and slipped away. The O'Bannon, unable to use its main weapons at such close range, couldn't do much more at that exact moment. But the encounter wasn't over. The O'Bannon immediately swung around and dropped a pattern of depth charges. These were the real weapons. These were what actually threatened the submarine. And according to naval records, after this attack, the Japanese submarine I-38 was never seen or heard from again. It was classified as sunk by the O'Bannon, so the submarine was sunk, but not by potatoes. It was sunk by well-placed depth charges by a destroyer doing its job in a very dangerous environment. The potatoes were just a bizarre, memorable detail from the moment of collision, a strange human footnote in a very serious battle. It's this unique close-quarters encounter where food was thrown in anger or frustration that spawned the entire legend. The story got twisted, exaggerated, and compressed over time. The throwing potatoes part became the sunk by potatoes part. And that's how a myth is born. The actual event, the ramming and the potato throwing, became famous among the O'Bannon crew. It was a you wouldn't believe what happened story. They told it, other sailors heard it, and it spread. But as stories spread, details often change. They get embellished. They become more dramatic, more absurd, more memorable. The core of the legend is the USS O'Bannon and a specific encounter with a Japanese submarine in April 1943. The O'Bannon, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was a real workhorse. She saw a lot of action in the Pacific. Her crew was tough and experienced. One day, while escorting a convoy, they spotted a Japanese submarine, the I-38, on the surface. This was a major threat. Submarines could launch torpedoes and cause huge damage. The O'Bannon moved fast. She charged the submarine. The Japanese crew knew they were in trouble and tried to dive. But the O'Bannon was too quick. As the submarine was going down, the destroyer actually scraped along its hull. They were literally side by side for a moment. This was incredibly close. Too close for the O'Bannon's main guns to aim at the sub. They couldn't depress that far, and it was too close to drop depth charges without risking damage to their own ship. It was a bizarre, dangerous moment. What happened next is the part that gave birth to the legend. As the ships were scraping past each other, the O'Bannon's crew could look right down onto the deck of the Japanese submarine. The Japanese sailors were scrambling, probably trying to man their deck gun or get below. In this moment of pure chaos, some of the O'Bannon's crew started throwing whatever they had on hand. And one of those things, supposedly, was a sack of potatoes. They hurled them down at the Japanese sailors. Now, why potatoes? It wasn't a tactical decision. It wasn't about sinking the sub. It was probably a mix of things. Maybe it was an attempt to distract the Japanese sailors, to keep them from using their deck gun. Maybe it was just sheer frustration, an immediate human reaction to being in such a strange, close combat situation. Or maybe it was just a dark prank, a way to vent adrenaline. The potatoes, of course, did nothing to the submarine. They just bounced off its metal hull. They were harmless. The Japanese submarine continued its dive and disappeared under the waves. The immediate confrontation ended there. But the O'Bannon wasn't done. As soon as the submarine was clear of their immediate position, the destroyer swung around. They dropped a pattern of depth charges. These were the real weapons. These were the things designed to destroy a submarine. And after this attack, the I-38 was never heard from again. It was recorded as sunk. So the sequence of events is clear. 1. O'Bannon spots I-38 on the surface. 2. O'Bannon charges and the sub tries to dive. The potato throwing was a real event, or at least a widely reported one by the crew. But it was a side note, a strange detail in a much larger, very serious battle. The potatoes did not sink the submarine. The depth charges did. This distinction is crucial. The story got twisted over time. People heard O'Bannon, Japanese submarine, and the potatoes, and eventually the part about the depth charges got lost or minimized. The potato became the star of the story. It was more unique, more unexpected, more funny. The close quarters battle between the O'Bannon and the I-38 is a genuine piece of naval history. It highlights the often chaotic and unpredictable nature of warfare. It shows the quick thinking and resourcefulness of sailors. But it also shows how easily a small, unusual detail can become the dominant part of a narrative, even if it's not the most important or accurate part of the story. The potato was an anecdote. The depth charges were the killing blow. The story of the potato-throwing destroyer is a fantastic example of how a small, unusual event can grow into a full-blown legend. It's not about malice or intentional deception. It's just how stories work, especially war stories. They get told and retold, passed from person to person, ship to ship, generation to generation. And with each telling, details can shift, get exaggerated, or sometimes get completely made up. Think about it. You're a sailor on the USS O'Bannon. You've just been in a terrifying, close-quarters fight with a Japanese submarine. You've literally been able to look down onto its deck. And in the heat of the moment, someone on your ship, maybe even you, threw some potatoes at the enemy. When you tell that story later, back in port, or to your family, which detail do you think gets the most attention? The standard depth charge attack, which was common, or the crazy, absurd fact that you threw potatoes at the enemy? Of course it's the potatoes. It's unique. It's funny. It makes people stop and listen. It's a great no-kidding moment. So the story starts as we sank a sub, and get this, we even threw potatoes at it while it was diving. Over time, through repeated tellings, the two parts of the sentence might get closer. We sank a sub with potatoes. And then eventually, the actual method of sinking gets dropped entirely, because the potato part is just so much more interesting. This kind of storytelling isn't new, it's part of human culture, we love a good story. And a good story often prioritizes drama, humor, or novelty over strict historical accuracy. The fog of war plays a role too. In the chaos of combat, details can be fuzzy. People remember different things or interpret events differently. What one sailor saw as a desperate act of harassment, another might remember as an attempt to cause damage. The potato story became a staple. It was probably told in bars, in letters home, in newspaper accounts that were slightly embellished. Each person who repeated it might have added a little bit, or left a little bit out. The core elements, U.S. destroyer, Japanese submarine, close encounter, potatoes remained, but the context shifted. There might also be a symbolic element. In a war full of high-tech weapons and immense destruction, the idea of a humble potato being involved in combat provides a kind of human-scale absurdity. It's a way of dealing with the grimness of finding something to laugh about in the face of death. It reduces the enemy, if only for a moment, to something that can be pelted with food. Other naval myths and legends exist too. Ghost ships, sea monsters, incredible feats of daring. Many of these have a tiny kernel of truth that gets blown up into something larger than life. The potato legend fits right into this tradition. It's memorable precisely because it's so unexpected and almost unbelievable. It's also possible that the potato story was used by some as a kind of shorthand. If someone said, "Remember that O'Bannon potato story?" everyone knew what they meant. They weren't literally suggesting the potato was a weapon. They were referring to the famous close encounter, the one where that odd thing with the potatoes happened. But over time, the shorthand can become the literal interpretation for those who weren't there or didn't hear the full original story. So, the potato's journey from a random item thrown in a moment of panic to a mythical weapon is a testament to the power of human storytelling. It's a journey from a real but minor detail to the center of a popular legend. It shows us how events, especially in times of great stress like war, can be reinterpreted, simplified, and amplified until they become something quite different from the original truth. The potato didn't sink the submarine, but it certainly launched a legendary story that has survived for decades. So we come back to the original question: did the US Navy accidentally sink a Japanese submarine with a potato? The answer, as we've seen, is no. Not in the way anyone might think. A potato is not a weapon that can destroy a submarine. The real sinking of the Japanese submarine I-38 was due to the powerful, purpose-built depth charges dropped by the USS O'Bannon. That's the hard historical fact. But the story of the potato persists. It's a prime example of how history and legend can intertwine, how a small, unusual detail can overshadow the larger, more conventional truth. The USS O'Bannon's close-quarters encounter with the I-38 in April 1943 was a remarkable moment in itself. The destroyer practically rammed the submarine as it tried to dive. The ships were so close that crewmen could see each other. And yes, in that chaotic, tense moment, some accounts say O'Bannon sailors threw potatoes and other objects at the Japanese crew on the submarine's deck. This act wasn't an attempt to sink the sub, it was a desperate spur-of-the-moment reaction. A way to harass, distract, or simply vent frustration in an incredibly bizarre combat situation. That the potatoes were harmless, but the image of them being thrown in the middle of a deadly war captured the imagination. The story was probably told and retold by the O'Bannon's crew, then by others who heard it. And as with all good stories, it grew. The potatoes, being such an odd and memorable detail, slowly took center stage. The actual very effective depth charge attack that followed became a footnote, or was simply forgotten in the retelling. The legend became "the potato sunk the submarine." Why does such a myth have such staying power? Several reasons. First, it's funny. The idea of a potato as a weapon is inherently comical. It provides a bit of levity in the grim, serious history of war. Laughter, even dark laughter, can be a coping mechanism. Second, it's memorable, it's unique. Most submarine sinkings involve torpedoes, depth charges, or bombs. A potato is completely out of place. This makes it stand out. Third, it humanizes the war. In a conflict dominated by massive machines and advanced technology, a simple potato brings a touch of human absurdity and improvisation to the battlefield. It suggests that even in the most serious situations, unexpected, almost comical things can happen. It makes the sailors seem more real, less like faceless warriors. Fourth, it's a testament to the power of storytelling. And humans love a good tale, and sometimes the truth isn't as captivating as a slightly embellished version. The potato story is a classic example of how a narrative can evolve, driven by a desire for a more dramatic, humorous, or simply more interesting account. But it's important to remember the real heroism and the real dangers. The crews of both the USS O'Bannon and the Japanese I-38 were in a life-or-death struggle. The O'Bannon's crew showed incredible bravery and skill in tracking and sinking the submarine. They performed their duty in one of the most dangerous theaters of war. The incident, minus the potato myth, highlights the intensity of anti-submarine warfare during World War II. So, while the potato story is fun and memorable, it's a myth. It's a legend born from a specific chaotic event where something truly strange happened. The potato did not sink a submarine, but it became an enduring symbol of a peculiar moment, a footnote that somehow became the headline. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of history, strange, unexpected, and even humorous things can happen, and that those human details can sometimes become more famous than the stark realities of war. The legend of the potato will likely continue to be told, a quirky reminder of a real battle and the way stories live on.